Who in their right mind would want to be a CISO today, especially at a publicly traded company?
Firmly in the regulatory crosshairs with SEC disclosure rules and a growing thicket of privacy and compliance regulations.
Subject to quarterly interrogations by a well-intentioned board that may, or more likely, may not understand the nature and the nuance of the threat landscape facing the company.
Under constant scrutiny from members of the C-suite, such as the CFO, despite the fact that cyber threats are exponentially increasing, but the budget for security most definitely is not.
Always hearing the sweet, whispering promise of vendors that can make all of this go away, if only you buy the upgraded triple titanium data ingest and support package.
Finding the strength to motivate and manage an underpaid and overworked team to defend against the latest nation-state attacks, while constantly dealing with Dave from accounts clicking on phishing emails from Microsoft.
No wonder the average CISO's employment tenure is measured in months and not years. I'm Chris Pullen, content strategist at CIO.com.
And I'm Robin Das, Executive Director at Strategy at DataB from Comcast Technology Solutions.
And welcome to Free the CISO, where, over the course of several episodes, we will delve into some of the more unique issues faced by CISOs today, share guidance for alleviating these issues, and, hopefully, free up a little more time for CISOs to take care of themselves and their teams, all while improving security and compliance. We will be exploring the CISO's relationship with various groups across the organization, both internal and external. But at the end of the day, it all starts with regulation and compliance. Robin, you've been talking to a lot of CISOs and other security experts lately. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. In this episode, we're going to dive headfirst into the topic that is always top of mind for CISOs and their security organizations: regulations and their compliance with those regulations. As new rules from the SEC and other regulatory bodies have come into effect this year, with their ever-increasing demands for faster reporting, more transparency, and longer data retention, is it finally time to ask, what is the point of all these regulations? And do they in fact make us any safer? Or is this just a way to spin the wheel of blame and point fingers after the fact? Monday morning quarterbacking at its finest, using the CISO as the football. We will hear perspectives from the regulated, talk about the penalties that can be incurred for lack of compliance, and look at some ways CISOs are trying to ease the burden that an ever-changing regulatory environment imposes on the enterprise. I spent a few hours trying to read various presidential executive orders, guidelines from Congress and Homeland Security, passing through acronyms like NIST and DORA and PCI, and tracing back into the agencies that were producing these documents. I soon realized I needed help to take a step back from understanding practically what regulations did and didn't cover. So I turned to help from Tom Schneider, a 40-year veteran of the cybersecurity and IT industry. Hi, Tom. Glad to have you with us.
Hi, Robin. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So let's start off with the most basic question. Why do regulations exist, and do you think they even make us safer?
So I think regulations really come from the same kind of general beginning as most laws do. They're there really to enforce a minimum level of protection and to get people to exhibit a certain behavior that they're not likely to exhibit otherwise, or to have that behavior more widely throughout society. So although some people may exhibit it without the regulation, a lot of organizations probably wouldn't without it. So I think that's kind of a driving force. And then another thing I think is it gives us the opportunity to standardize the controls that we want to enforce. And that's important because there's a lot of complexity in cybersecurity and a lot of different ways to do things.
And so with these regulations, they're starting to have more teeth, as in sort of the actions, the enforcement seems to be sort of, growing steeper and the penalties seem to be growing steeper. Like, why do you think that is?
So I think financial penalties, really have kind of two purposes. Probably the main one is to be a deterrent. So to get organizations to think that it's going to be, significant enough if they get penalized or they get fined, that is something they want to avoid. Then I guess secondarily, they're there as a punishment. So again, if an organization doesn't abide by the regulation, it gives the agency some way to try to enforce some kind of consequences where that's a behavior, again, that other organizations are going to want to avoid. And then the other thing to point out there really is the worst case situation typically is that you're removed from a particular market or service. Although PCI DSS isn't a federal regulation, it's just an industry standard. The ultimate punishment there is to not be able to process credit cards. And then some of the legal penalties, I think those, especially the ones that are addressed towards individuals, I think the main intention there is just to have a means to address intentional misrepresentation. So where an organization has, or not an organization, a person has made statements that they knew to be misleading or false, that legal penalty gives regulatory agency a way to respond to that.
And is that part of, the growing shift towards some of these criminal penalties for the CISO that we've been seeing?
Yes, I think so. I think it's, primarily the argument, at least from the regulatory agencies, is that there's a person who's been either less than forthcoming or is intentionally made misleading statements. And like in the case with the SEC, the idea is that you're making statements affect the investors who invest in your organization. So if you're, it's similar to the whole Sarbanes-Oxley conundrum back in the early 2000s, where if you're making things that misrepresent the viability of your organization, then that's potentially impacting the financial outcomes for the people that invest in you.
Let's assume good intent, so we can put sort of actual criminal intent to one side. But, is there any way or any mechanism or any sort of things they can use to get a better handle on making sure the representations they are making are accurate?
So, to some degree, that's, based on data. It's based on what you can collect and understand about your organization. Trying not to have blind spots that would cause you to make an unintentional misrepresentation. I think another thing that comes into play there is, I think historically, CISOs have felt like they may have been pressured to misrepresent things at times. So they knew there were things, cybersecurity controls that weren't as robust as they should be, but they would feel like they had to report that everything was fine, like within a financial report or in any kind of public statements, to minimize any negative impact to the organization.
This begs the question, are compliance standards really about security or just where to place liability?
I think they're primarily focused on security. And I think that kind of leads to an interesting conversation because there's a statement, compliance doesn't equal security, that gets repeated a lot. I think maybe more in the past than it does now. But it kind of equates, if you've got some kind of compliance regimen or some kind of regulation, if it doesn't completely prevent security incidents or breaches, then somehow that must mean that particular compliance standard is flawed. And I think that's not really a very helpful way to look at compliance or regulatory requirements. I think they're more really foundational requirements. So they're just establishing, again, a baseline. So it's a good place to start from. And then, of course, if they want to build on top of that and have a more risk-based, more sophisticated cybersecurity program, that's a great improvement. But essentially, all those more sophisticated and more robust programs are going to rely on the foundational things that are going to show up in your compliance frameworks anyway. If you want to have a valid, really good cybersecurity program, there's pretty much no way around addressing those basics that show up in the standards.
While clearer about what regulations were meant to cover, I still want to get a better insight into the people pulling the strings from behind the curtain and get a better understanding on both what they were trying to accomplish, how companies were doing at complying with regulations, and where they thought regulations were headed. So I turned to Kristen Maynes, a partner with PwC's Cyber Risk and Regulatory Practice. Hi, Kristen. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Robin. Thank you for having me.
As technology changes and the types of attacks increase and the world gets more complex, are regulations able to keep up with it, or should we just think of regulations as the starting point and just table stakes?
It's a great question. And I would say in general, regulations really have a lagging effect, right? They really are lagging innovation and change relative to, the threat landscape and all the different complexities there. So it really, those requirements are static, right? They're sort of one time put in place. And, they are not necessarily keeping up with the rapid pace of change in our environment or in our ecosystems. So I think, understanding that those are a critical and crucial baseline, but also should not be the strategy for the organization moving forward, but rather lending towards a more data-driven, real-time understanding of what's happening in your environment is really the best approach, right? So you cannot rely on regulations and those standards, which are point in time, static, and often be lagging to set the standard or set the security strategy for an organization. Certainly not the risk tolerance, right? It's a good input, but you must really think beyond that and to understand where your true risks are and focus your controls around that through a data-driven approach.
Is the data-driven approach what the best-in-class companies should be doing?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I think there is certainly no modern security organization who is not looking at and relying on data and meaningful insights from that data to manage their cyber risk profile.
How do you see these regulations evolving and changing over the next few years? And are there any things companies should be doing now to prepare for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think certainly we don't have a crystal ball, but what I think we can best guess is that we will continue to see stricter, more enhanced data privacy requirements and regulations coming out, right? So obviously this is not new. We've seen a lot of activity relative to data security and privacy. So I think we should expect to see more of that. I think we should expect to also see more focus on emerging technologies, obviously with AI and other trends really driving the technology agenda. We're already seeing a lot of this, but I think that will only continue to see more focused on that. Supply chain security as well, right? We just talked about the risks associated with our third party and vendor ecosystems. So I think we'll see more transparency requirements there and different expectations on how we're managing those different risks associated with our vendors. We have already seen a push towards more transparent incident reporting, obviously through the SEC cyber requirements and others. So I think that will only continue to increase. And lastly, and again, not necessarily new, but I think we'll see more focus on is around critical infrastructure and with a specific focus on cyber resiliency and how our organizations how can organizations weather the storm and really recover from those things negative activities in a meaningful way.
With this increase in pressure from the SEC on this breach disclosure and transparency when an organization has had an incident, how, in your opinion, can the enterprise better meet these challenges? Because it seems like it's going to be a heavy burden to place on the team.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it ultimately comes down to of course, having that risk management strategy clearly defined, but in a way that you can more heavily lean on data insights to inform your actions and to inform where you place your bets relative to your different risks, right? Not every asset can be treated the same, but where are you really prioritizing those different controls around that?
Every CEO knows what the SEC is more than they would know what a NIST framework is. And so do you think this is going to sort of change the way that companies approach their cybersecurity posture or even sort of what they say about their cybersecurity posture or their disclosures?
I think it already has because of the SEC cyber requirements. I think the conversation has shifted outside of cyber and IT shops to boardrooms, right? Because they have to. Finance teams and finance leaders are asking these same questions and really talking about the NIST cybersecurity framework, for example, or other, core cyber programming that, they never did before. And so it is very, it has changed the narrative on organizations in a positive way. I think, organizations are now thinking about cyber risk and resilience in a way that they haven't before. I think that's the positive part of some of the regulatory changes. Now we can debate that, there's different level of impact and, challenges associated with it. But in many ways, that the positive outcome here is that it's up-leveled the conversation. And so we're seeing, good movement towards risk-based, data-driven approaches to managing cyber risk versus, organizations of the past who have really struggled to get the right attention and impact that they would need to manage the program.
And has that expanded the areas? Because I think if we think about, or if I think about cybersecurity, a lot of the times it was about defense and protection. But has that now evolved the conversation sort of beyond defense and protection to things like, I think you were mentioning earlier, like resiliency?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's no longer just about those preventative measures and hoping it doesn't happen, but really about our ability and organization's ability to withstand those events and the resilience around those things, to not only keep the lights on and the company running, but recover in a meaningful way that doesn't disrupt operations, morale, right, customer impact, potential regulatory fines, right, all that. So it definitely has shifted the narrative.
So is it cyber resiliency and sort of maybe business continuity, some of those elements as well?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, not only just, again, your incident response planning and activities and testing of those things, but your true crisis management, through crisis and disaster recovery capabilities that is shared, right? That's a shared responsibility across the organization. That doesn't just sit in one shop or one silo. That really is a joint responsibility to initiate those crisis management plans, those communications associated with it, the different continuity measures that must be enacted and put in place in the event of an outage or incident. So it really has moved in that. The focus is on that as well.
Data is almost at this point the table stakes piece of it, and there's like a bunch of additional skills like you were talking about, crisis recovery plans. It's engaging all parts of the organization and requires more than just data held by security teams. It's become a team sport more than a responsibility of the security team.
Yeah, that's a phrase we use a lot, that, cyber is a team sport and you must, engage. And this gets back to, leaders and different teams, relationships within the organization and really having transparency around the risk and having discussions there. But it absolutely is a team sport and must, and requires collaboration across the business, across many different teams. Again, some of the regulatory pieces are pushing or making that a priority, but the most mature and effective programs that we see are ones that rely on data, that have insights derived from that data that they can action in a very meaningful way. That's risk-based and business-centric. So it isn't, pushing something that doesn't, that really isn't a critical risk or a risk you can absorb, and prioritizing that in the right way with the right business leaders.
Well, they're clearly looking to help make security more widespread across the enterprise, and we're definitely allies in the quest for better security. It seemed that the level of compliance and regulations were only going to increase as security threats and technological complexity did. There are some things that the enterprise can do to prepare, but I thought it made sense to get additional perspective from someone tasked with working with both the business and the regulations. Hi, Yasmine. Would love for you to introduce yourself to me in the podcast.
Hi, my name is Yasmine Abdillahi. I'm an executive director at Comcast in cybersecurity, governance, risk, and compliance, where I oversee policy and standards and compliance programs. And I'm also the Business Information Security Officer, the CISO for Comcast Business.
So you seem exactly like the person we need to help us free the CISO. Where would you say the trade-off is between business goals and the cost of compliance?
So managing that is really a balancing act. There is an additional cost in terms of time, effort, tools to be compliant. However, compliance also sustains business opportunities and revenue. It's necessary to do business, and also it helps to mitigate risk, right? Which helps to avoid some costs of disruption or data breach. So I think our role in supporting the CISO and the business in that trade-off, because it is a trade-off, is to really help with, our role is to speak the business so we can help communicate the requirements and determine the most cost-effective way to be compliant. We also need to understand the business because the requirements apply to certain risk. To understand the risk, we need to understand the resources, the operations, the people who are doing the work. So understanding really helps to prioritize where we implement those requirements. And then having a continuous enhancement mindset also helps in that trade-off. So we steer it towards the benefits instead of the costs.
In your mind, like, how does the enterprise prepare for both the existing set of regulations and then, as we know, they're going to be coming sort of the future regulations?
So when I look at regulations, I think the regulations are both predictable and unpredictable. On the predictable side, we know that when we have new technologies, new risks, new threats, there is going to be regulation on those areas. And also in the industry, sometimes we are asked to provide feedback, comments to upcoming regulations. So we do have a preview. However, we don't necessarily know the penalty of not being compliant. This is not always like upfront, which is a key factor in accounting for compliance. And then there are more and more and more organizations that and jurisdiction that establish rules that impact cyber programs and cyber controls. So it's not always predictable. Now, to prepare, the first thing is to know what we have, because we know that compliance will apply to resources that are at risk, data that are at risk, people like administrators who are at risk. Then we need to know really well what we have in the organization. And then the way we look at controls, it's always the same families of controls that we have, across privacy and security. So having a good understanding of that and using automation to map them and to have, that automated mapping of the risk, the controls, internal controls mapped to the frameworks, to the measurement of those controls, help to better prepare. It helps to assess faster, and it helps to prepare faster.
And so what are some of the ways or best practices you've seen to kind of both automate and sort of know what we have?
So I see first efforts in having an inventory that is data-driven and automated of the assets, the owners, where those assets are, some metadata that really helps to understand the profile of those. That's kind of a starting point. From there, depending on the tools that we use to protect those assets, is starting to bring information together to understand the level of protection of those assets. And that's where, all that lands kind of in a continuous compliance monitoring ecosystem where we know what we have and we know the level of protection of what we have.
And would you say, sort of with the world that we're living in now, sort of automation and continuous controls is almost table stakes?
Yes, it is. It is because it goes much faster. So the borders between organizations are not that clear. So it's important to have visibility near real time into what we have, what we do, even the data flows, the connection points. So yes, it's absolutely a requirement these days to be able to be agile, to be able to make decisions, to be able also to recover faster and make better decisions timely in the current pace of business and technology.
The SEC now has these strict timelines on disclosing incidents. Like, what additional level of effort do you see that's going to place on the enterprise? Like more analysts, more burnout, more time?
So definitely managing resources, which is a constraint for everybody, including cyber organization, but also in terms the timeliness aspect means that information is available quickly, can be vetted quickly, can be interpreted and cross-referenced and correlated quickly. I think that's what adds a lot of the pressure on the teams in charge of incident disclosure. We also enhance the quality of the data because there is a feedback loop to the different data providers in the organization. And all that will be very beneficial when there is an incident and we need to find that needle in the haystack very quickly based on all the data we have in the organization.
How do sort of companies get more access to their data? Because some of it seems kind of be locked up in silos today.
Yeah, so that's fair, especially in security and in technology in general. When we think about just understanding our assets and then also the level of protection, we do have a lot of data silos because we just use the technology stack used in technology and reliability and in security is very large. So we do deal with technology silos. So to be more mature around data and to be then better prepared, it means that we need to break those silos. And here we've taken an approach of breaking those silos and having all those data elements in a data lake and normalized so that we can cross-reference them and use them and make sense of them for the different consumers of the data. But you're right, like so many tools are used by different teams. Your endpoint protection team is not going to be the same as your vulnerability team, is not going to be the same as the disaster recovery team or the vendor risk management team. However, you still need to be able to correlate those data elements to proactively manage and understand what you have and what's the level of risk and what decisions you make. So you're right, it's an effort to break those silos, but there are so many benefits in terms of day-to-day operations, technology decisions, and then incident preparedness that is worth it.
While we heard from Kristen on the evolution of regulatory frameworks and Yasmine on how to apply it to business, I wanted to check in again with Tom to get his final thoughts on where he thought regulations might be headed in the future and how to be best prepared for it. If I was a betting man, I would definitely take the bet that regulations are probably going to grow in the future. Is there a way that the enterprise can better prepare for both the existing as well as future regulations?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think you're correct that regulations and just general requirements around cybersecurity, even if they're not necessarily regulatory driven, are going to increase, and the ability to implement a viable cybersecurity program and a more sophisticated program, that's going to become more and more essential for organizations to do business. So I think probably the best way really to prepare for the future is to think of how you can improve your cybersecurity program overall. Because ultimately, if you've got a really robust cybersecurity program, that's either going to probably meet a lot of regulatory requirements already, or it's going to position you to more easily be able to meet those if new ones are introduced that you're not currently covering. So I think just understanding how to do cybersecurity better and how to do it more efficiently, more cost effectively, that's probably the best couple of ways that you have to prepare for the future.
We promised at the start of this episode to help free the CISO. So while their intent is good, like Nate Dogg and Warren G., regulators gonna regulate. And as the world becomes more complex, there will be an increasing regulatory burden. However, as acronyms go, SEC probably strikes more fear into the hearts of business executives, especially non-cyber ones, than NIST or the adorably named DORA has ever done. As Churchill once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So could this be the opportunity CISOs have been waiting for to create a more security data-driven culture? One born out of necessity that has to give them faster answers and a more continuous view of their security environment. Although regulations enable the CISO to wield the regulatory stick, a security-driven data culture can also enable them to provide the carrot through providing business value. Leveraging the security data lake means data can now be more accessible via different tools, making security a shared responsibility, but one with actionable metrics.
Thank you for that overview, Robin. On our next episode, we will be looking at a group of people charged not only with regulatory oversight, but oversight of the whole shebang, the board of directors. As these venerable captains of industry sail into town once a quarter to check everything is battened down and shipshape, we will discuss ways the CISO can effectively signal their security strategy, use evidence-centric metrics to back it up, and review the potential threats brewing on the horizon, all while easing the reporting burden on them and their teams.
Thanks for listening to Free the CISO, a podcast by Data B from Comcast Technology Solutions. Stay tuned for our next episode on CIO.com, the number one resource serving the evolving, challenging, and demanding role of the Chief Information Officer. CIO.com provides these important decision makers with the information they need to lead their organizations into the digital-first age. The views and opinions expressed by the participants are their own and do not reflect any official policy or position of Comcast.